Cartoons once painted childhood with bright colors and catchy jingles, but some left a stain so deep it still sparks outrage. Behind the laughter hid ugly stereotypes, racism disguised as humor, and cultural mockery animated for mass consumption. These 10 cartoons from the 70s and 80s shocked generations and aged like poison. Here are the most racist cartoons you were never meant to remember. Number 10. The Harlem Globetrotters, 1970. On the surface, it looked like progress, an all-black cast of basketball heroes in a Saturday morning cartoon. But the Harlem Globetrotters was no victory for representation. It was a backdoor minstrel show wrapped in bounce passes and slam dunks. Hanna-Barbera's animation relied on outdated caricatures and lazy stereotypes masquerading as street charm. Each team member had a distinct, exaggerated trait. One spoke in broken jive. Another acted like a coward. The comedy was less about sports and more about reducing black identity to slapstick confusion and dumbed-down dialects. The show's villains were often depicted as urban thugs or comically corrupt white businessmen. Yet the Globetrotters rarely spoke or acted like real athletes or real black Americans. They were one-dimensional background noise to the plot. Even the music leaned into stereotype with funky soul beats that felt more like parody than celebration. For kids watching in the suburbs, it offered a distorted mirror of blackness. For black kids, it offered a narrow, humiliating echo of how media saw them. There was no effort to show depth, intelligence, or authentic culture. Just bouncing balls, goofy laughs, and watered-down voices meant to appease white executives. Despite its historic cast, the cartoon ultimately failed its own premise. Representation without dignity is not progress. It is mockery drawn in ink. Number 9. Hong Kong Phooey, 1974. He wore a G, spoke in rhymes, and karate chopped his way into American living rooms. But Hong Kong Phooey was not a tribute to martial arts. He was a racial caricature disguised as a Saturday morning superhero. The show parodied Eastern culture in the most cartoonish way possible, with every gag dipped in lazy Orientalism. Voiced by the legendary Scatman Crothers, the titular character was a janitor named Penry who transformed into a bumbling kung fu crime fighter. He mispronounced words, crashed into objects, and misunderstood every situation he faced. But instead of satire aimed at superhero tropes, the real joke was always on Asian culture. His kung fu was nonsense, his wisdom was idiocy, and his name itself reduced an entire region of the world to a punchline. Set to stereotypical chime-heavy music and punctuated with faux proverbs, the show became a highlight reel of everything Western media got wrong about Asia. Martial arts were treated as magic spells. Chinese and Japanese cultural symbols were jumbled together with no understanding. The humor never came from clever writing or sharp parody. It came from mocking the mystique of the East. Worse still, it introduced young audiences to the idea that Asian identity was inherently funny, confusing, or inferior. Hong Kong Phooey was not heroic. He was clumsy, illogical, and reduced to a joke by his own creators. And while adults may have shrugged it off, kids absorbed the message quietly that Asian culture was something to mock, not respect. This was not cultural appreciation. It was cartoon colonialism, broadcast in bright colors and ignorance. Number 8. Super Globetrotters, 1979. If the original Harlem Globetrotters cartoon was problematic, the sequel became a full-blown animated embarrassment. Super Globetrotters turned the team into superheroes with powers like stretching into spaghetti or transforming into liquid. But behind the surreal abilities was something more sinister, racial mockery veiled as comedy for kids. Each Globetrotter was assigned a superpower that bordered on the grotesque. Liquid Man could melt into puddles. Multi-Man could duplicate himself endlessly. The creators claimed it was all for laughs, but the exaggeration of physical traits often mirrored minstrel-era stereotypes. Lips widened, speech patterns slowed, personality quirks leaned into outdated portrayals of black foolishness. And the villains? They were worse. Over-the-top caricatures with stereotypical accents who battled the Globetrotters in nonsensical plots that reinforced the idea of black intelligence as accidental or clumsy. The Globetrotters never strategized. They stumbled into victory. Unlike other superhero teams of the era, they were never taken seriously. Hanna-Barbera aimed to turn black excellence into a superhero brand. but they stripped away the dignity of the real Globetrotters. There was no commentary, no empowerment, just recycled jokes built on visual distortion and cultural erasure. Their athleticism became a circus act. Their blackness became a marketing gimmick. By the late 70s, network executives were desperate to add diversity to Saturday mornings, but Super Globetrotters proved that visibility without respect leads only to animated exploitation. It may have been masked as a celebration, but behind the capes, it was pure cartoon degradation. Number 7. Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, 1972. This one stings because it came from within the community. Created by Bill Cosby, Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids was meant to uplift inner-city youth with moral lessons and relatable stories. But the show's execution fell into the trap of reinforcing the very stereotypes it claimed to challenge. The kids lived in a rundown neighborhood, wore ragged clothes, and spoke in exaggerated street slang. Each character was defined by a single trait. Dumb Donald wore a hat over his face. Mushmouth spoke in gibberish. Rudy was a flashy hustler. Even Fat Albert himself was portrayed as kind but slow-moving and overly simplistic. The message was often noble, but the vehicle delivering it leaned on cartoon tropes that simplified black life into digestible clichés. Episodes tackled real issues like racism, drugs, and poverty, yet they were often wrapped in cringe-worthy animation, poor voice acting, and recycled moralizing that felt more like lectures than storytelling. And while Cosby voiced most characters, he also filtered them through a lens of respectability, politics that blamed the kids more than the system. For many viewers, it was the first time they saw black kids as cartoon protagonists. But others noticed the lack of nuance and the reliance on outdated minstrel-inspired design choices. The laugh tracks masked the discomfort, the painted-on positivity hid the shame. Fat Albert was a step forward in concept, but 2 steps back in representation. It showed black life, but only through a foggy mirror of stereotypes, tradition, and pity. It tried to teach lessons, but forgot to teach dignity. Number 6. Speedy Gonzalez, reruns, 1970s to 80s. He ran fast, talked faster, and wore a sombrero bigger than his head. But Speedy Gonzalez was no hero for Mexican audiences. Throughout the 70s and 80s, this old Warner Brothers character became a Saturday morning staple, and with him came a tidal wave of racist stereotyping wrapped in slapstick animation. Speedy was voiced with an over-the-top accent and constantly used broken English. His favorite pastimes included stealing cheese, drinking tequila, and outsmarting slow or lazy characters, most of whom were also Mexican mice depicted as sleepy, drunk, or stupid. The joke was never on Speedy's enemies, it was on the culture itself. He was surrounded by cousins who napped under cacti or slurred their words through mustaches. The background music mimicked mariachi clichés, and every line of dialogue was laced with cultural mockery. It did not matter that Speedy was technically the hero. The entire cast reinforced an ugly vision of Mexican life, chaotic, slow, and stuck in time. When Latino advocacy groups eventually protested the character's use, many studios quietly removed him from broadcasts. But by then the damage was done. Millions of kids had internalized the stereotype of the funny little Mexican with the big hat and silly voice. And they laughed without knowing why. Speedy Gonzalez became a symbol of how even good intentions, or seemingly harmless cartoons, could fuel generations of prejudice. He ran circles around racism and called it entertainment, but the finish line was always humiliation. Number 5. The Super Friends, 1973. Super Friends was DC Comics' flagship cartoon, bringing heroes like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman to a younger audience. But behind the capes and catchphrases lay some of the worst tokenism ever animated. The show tried to be inclusive. Instead, it painted minorities with one brush, the stereotype brush. To appease diversity pressures, the creators invented new ethnic characters instead of using real comic book heroes of color. Apache Chief was a Native American whose power was to grow tall while shouting a nonsensical chant. Black Vulcan was a watered-down version of Black Lightning with lightning powers and a speech pattern lifted from 1970s blaxploitation scripts. Samurai was a Japanese warrior who literally created tornadoes by spinning and quoting faux proverbs in broken English. None of these characters had real backstories. None had depth. They were props, silent until summoned. Their costumes were stereotypes. Their dialogue was reduced to cultural cliches. While Superman made speeches and Batman solved mysteries, these minority heroes grunted, shouted, or vanished altogether until the episode required them to represent their race. Kids growing up on Super Friends learned that minorities existed in the superhero world, but only as sidekicks or cultural mascots. There was no real celebration of heritage, just hollow symbols created by white writers who knew little and cared even less about authenticity. Super Friends tried to tick the inclusion box, but it did so by stuffing characters into racial boxes, and once inside those boxes they were rarely allowed out. Representation meant nothing when the script never gave you lines worth saying. Number 4. The New Adventures of Gilligan, 1974. When Filmation brought the Gilligan's Island cast back in cartoon form, something else came with them, a wave of cultural racism directed at fictional island natives. The New Adventures of Gilligan introduced so-called natives who were nothing short of colonial nightmares animated for laughs. These characters were drawn with exaggerated features, wild eyes, and grass skirts. They spoke in broken pidgin English, bowed to idols, and were obsessed with pleasing or attacking the white castaways. Their behavior was a blend of outdated jungle movie tropes and cartoon slapstick, portraying indigenous people as childlike worshippers or comic threats who danced around fires and stole supplies. The cartoon never explained who these islanders were. They had no culture, no history, and no purpose beyond serving as exotic obstacles for the Gilligan gang. And despite being voiced by actors with no connection to the cultures they mimicked, the show leaned heavily on fake accents and guttural noises to highlight their otherness. In a post-colonial lens, The New Adventures of Gilligan becomes a case study in how children's media normalized the dehumanization of indigenous cultures. It taught kids that the natives were savage, comedic, or both, and that white characters were the civilizing force. The laughter came at the cost of an entire worldview. This was not innocent misrepresentation. It was imperialist storytelling dressed in Saturday morning colors, a fantasy where the island was just a playground and its people nothing more than animated wallpaper. Number 3. The Tarzan Lone Ranger Zorro Adventure Hour, 1980. Filmation's Tarzan Lone Ranger and Zorro Adventure Hour seemed like a tribute to classic pulp heroes. Instead, it resurrected the worst colonial and racial attitudes of early cinema, but this time for impressionable young minds. Now kids could see racism in motion every Saturday morning. Tarzan's segments were the most egregious. African tribes were depicted as primitive headhunters with spears, grass skirts, and unintelligible grunts. Their skin tones were exaggerated. Their movements were animalistic. Tarzan, the white jungle man, was their savior, fluent in the animals but barely tolerating the natives. The message was old but clear. White domination equals order. Black bodies equal chaos. The Lone Ranger cartoons added Native American stereotypes into the mix. Tonto was reimagined with stoic silence, feathered attire, and spiritual mysticism, reduced to a helper with no voice or agency. Zorro's episodes included bumbling peasants and corrupt Latino leaders, depicted in thick accents with cartoon villainy. Even the narration leaned into colonial romanticism. Tarzan was always the noble outsider. The locals were never individuals, just tribes to be saved or enemies to be tamed. There was no historical context, no critique of empire, no exploration of culture. Just pulp fiction rewritten as propaganda for a new generation. This was not just nostalgia, it was indoctrination. A 3-in-1 cartoon that recycled the worst fantasies of white superiority and made them palatable for Saturday mornings. The adventure came at the expense of accuracy, and the heroes rode through jungles built on ignorance. Number 2. The Bugs Bunny Roadrunner Show. Reruns, 1970s to 80s. By the 70s, Warner Bros. Had bundled its classic Looney Tunes shorts into the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner Show, a colorful hour of slapstick. But within those reruns lurked a darker legacy. Dozens of the cartoons included shockingly racist content broadcast straight into homes without warning or context. Characters appeared in blackface. Jokes mocked African tribal customs, Chinese accents, Native American speech patterns, and Japanese facial features. During wartime episodes, Bugs Bunny dressed as a samurai to mock Japanese soldiers using buck teeth and slanted eyes. Elmer Fudd hunted savage caricatures in jungle settings. Even Daffy Duck found himself battling grossly exaggerated Axis characters in shorts once deemed patriotic. The problem was not just the age of these cartoons, it was their casual recycling. Kids in the 70s and 80s watched these edited or sometimes unedited episodes on network television where racism came masked in Technicolor and laugh tracks. The slapstick softened the blow, but the message remained. People who looked different were punchlines. In later decades, these cartoons were quietly pulled or aired with disclaimers, but by then millions had already absorbed the imagery. Parents rarely knew what aired. Networks rarely cared. And Bugs Bunny kept cracking jokes even while playing minstrel roles. The Bugs Bunny Road Runner show was not just a rerun reel, it was a time bomb of cultural damage, charming on the outside and poisonous at its core. What started as animated rebellion became a mirror of American prejudice replayed for children every weekend. Number 1. The Little Rascals, animated. 1982. The animated reboot of The Little Rascals was supposed to revive a beloved classic, but what it brought back was not innocence. It was a polished version of vintage racism, served again to a new generation under the guise of nostalgia and friendship. The original R-Gang shorts from the 30s already leaned heavily into offensive stereotypes, particularly with characters like Buckwheat. The animated series updated the formula with bright colors and slick production, but kept the most problematic elements intact. Buckwheat was drawn with exaggerated features and voiced with an accent that echoed minstrel show cadences. His lines were limited. His presence was often comedic relief, never leadership. The animation emphasized ragged clothes and childlike ignorance, particularly in the black and poor white characters. The adventures were innocent on the surface, but the depiction of class and race reinforced old messages. Black characters were goofy or slow. White characters solved the problems. Harmony came only when everyone followed the leader, usually white and male. Even the voice casting drew criticism. None of the voice actors were children. Many were white actors doing black voices for effect. That choice alone revealed how little the creators understood or respected the material they were modernizing. Instead of reimagining The Little Rascals as a celebration of real diversity and childhood resilience, they replayed the past with no filter. The result was a reboot that looked modern but smelled ancient, full of echoes that should have stayed buried. It was not a tribute. It was a warning. These cartoons were not harmless relics. They were animated weapons built on mockery and ignorance disguised as fun. As we revisit these eras, we must name their damage frame by frame. The ink may have dried, but the impact still echoes. Stay vigilant, stay critical, and never stop unlearning what was once animated truth.